He didn't even lower his voice. That's what broke her. Not the woman standing close enough to straighten his tie. Not the laughter she didn't recognize anymore. It was the way Lucien de Luca, the man who had whispered "I love you" into her hair every single morning, stood in front of his family, his lawyers, his entire world, and called their marriage complicated, like she was a problem he hadn't gotten around to solving. Serena Hale stood frozen in that hallway, with one hand pressed flat against her stomach, carrying a secret she'd spent 3 days building the courage to share. Inside her purse, a pair of baby shoes no bigger than her palm, and an ultrasound photo she'd already memorized. She never said a word. She simply turned around, walked out the door, and disappeared. If this kind of story stops you cold, the kind where love gets weaponized by silence and pride, then you're exactly who I made this for. Subscribe to the channel right now and hit that notification bell, because every week we bring you stories that hit different. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. And if it moved you, hit that like button. It costs nothing and means everything. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because you need to understand exactly who Serena was before you can understand what leaving cost her. Serena Hale had never been the kind of woman who needed saving. That was the thing people never quite understood about her. She'd grown up in a 2-bedroom house in Atlanta with a mother who worked double shifts at a laundry service and a father who left when Serena was 9 and never sent so much as a birthday card afterward. She didn't grow up believing in fairy tales. She grew up believing in rent money and grocery lists, and the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from watching someone you love work themselves down to the bone just to keep the lights on. So she got good at taking care of herself early. Not in a hard, brittle way, in a quiet, steady way. She learned to cook at 11 because her mother came home too tired to stand at the stove. She learned to fix a leaking faucet at 14 from a YouTube video because calling a plumber cost money they didn't have. She earned a partial scholarship to a design school in New York at 22, packed one suitcase, and got on a bus heading north without once looking back at the life she was leaving. New York tried to eat her alive, the way it does with everyone who arrives thinking ambition is enough. Her first apartment was a room she shared with 3 other girls in a walk-up in Queens, where the heat stopped working every February without fail. She freelanced. She took on corporate logo work she found boring, packaging design for products she'd never heard of, rebranding jobs for restaurants that paid in installments. She ate ramen and generic cereal for longer than she liked to admit. She kept a running list of every client who paid late and crossed each name off with genuine satisfaction when the invoice finally cleared. She wasn't miserable. She was building something. There's a difference, and Serena always understood that difference. She met Lucien de Luca at a gallery opening she'd been hired to design the event branding for. The invitations, the wall signage, the promotional materials. She wasn't there as a guest. She was there as the person making sure the vinyl lettering on the far wall didn't peel before 10 o'clock. She was on her knees with a heat gun and a credit card, trying to smooth out a bubble near the baseboard, when a pair of very expensive shoes stopped directly beside her. "Is it supposed to do that?" a man's voice said. She didn't look up. "No, which is why I'm fixing it." "Do you need help?" "I need you to move about 3 inches to your left so I can see what I'm doing." A pause. Then the shoes shifted left. She finished smoothing the bubble, sat back on her heels, and finally looked up. He was, she would tell her mother this later, laughing at herself, almost aggressively good-looking. The kind of face that seemed engineered to make people uneasy. Dark eyes. Strong jaw. The particular stillness of a man who'd never once had to fill silence with nervous talking. I was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize, which was unusual. Serena had always been good at reading people. "Better?" he asked. "Better," she said, and stood up and walked away. He found her 20 minutes later at the back of the room, checking her phone for the caterer's number. He said his name was Lucien. She said she was working. He said he knew he'd commissioned the event, and he'd like to know who had designed the invitation because it was the best piece of graphic work he'd seen all year. She looked at him evenly. "That was me." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like recalibration. "Can I buy you a drink after this?" "I don't drink with clients." "I'm not your client. The gallery is your client. I'm just a man who noticed exceptional work." She thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. "1 drink," she said, "and I'm leaving by 10:30. She left at midnight. The thing about Lucien was that he listened in a way that felt almost aggressive in its focus. Most men she'd dated half-listened, their eyes drifting, their responses slightly delayed, like they were waiting for their turn to talk rather than actually absorbing what she was saying. Lucien didn't do that. When she talked, he was completely, uncomfortably present. It made her feel both seen and slightly exposed, like standing under a light that was too bright. He was careful about what he told her that first night. She'd find out later just how careful. He said he ran a family business. He said the business was complicated. He said he'd grown up in New York and hadn't left because he'd never found a reason compelling enough to make him want to. He asked about Atlanta. He asked about her mother. He asked about the design work. Not politely, not the way people ask when they're being courteous, but with genuine curiosity about the process, about what made her choose certain typefaces, about how she thought about negative space. She drove home that night with her hands tight on the wheel, already annoyed at herself for how much she'd enjoyed the conversation. They dated for 8 months before she learned what the DeLuca family actually was. And by then, she was already in love with him. Not the foolish, blinding kind of love that makes people ignore obvious warnings. The slow, terrifying kind of love that creeps up on you while you're doing ordinary things, while you're arguing with him about whether a certain shade of blue reads as trustworthy or cold, while you're watching him fall asleep on her couch with his tie loosened, while you're noticing that he always puts his phone away when she's talking and you've never once had to ask him to. When he finally sat her down and told her all of it. Not a cleaned-up version, the actual shape of what his family did and who they were in the city's underworld. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She sat very still and looked at him for a long time. "Why are you telling me now?" she asked. "Because I'm not willing to build anything else with you on a lie." She left that night. She spent 3 days in her apartment alone, not returning his calls, eating takeout, and staring at the ceiling. She thought about her mother, who had loved a man who walked out when things got hard. She thought about what it meant to know someone's worst truth and stay anyway. She thought about whether love was ever really a choice, or just something that happened to you whether you consented to it or not. On the 4th day, she called him back. "I'm not promising I won't leave," she said. "I'm promising I'll stay until I have a reason not to." He was quiet for a moment, then, "That's more honest than most people ever give me." "I know," she said. "Try not to waste it." They married quietly, 18 months after that gallery opening. No massive ceremony. Serena had no interest in being put on display, and Lucian's world was complicated enough without turning their private life into a public performance. Her mother flew up from Atlanta. A few of Lucian's associates attended, men with careful eyes who shook Serena's hand with too much deliberateness. She smiled at each of them and filed their faces away. The first year of marriage was not a honeymoon. Lucien worked brutal hours. He carried a particular kind of tension in his shoulders that never fully released, a tightness she recognized as the physical cost of managing things that could go wrong in irreversible ways. There were nights he came home and didn't speak for the first hour, just sat at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, decompressing. She learned to give him that silence without taking it personally. She, in turn, kept building her own career. She'd started a small studio by then, taking on select clients, building a reputation slowly and without shortcuts. She didn't ask Lucien for connections or introductions. He offered twice. She declined both times, calmly but firmly. "I'm not going to be the mafia boss's wife who gets design contracts out of implied threats," she told him. He'd almost smiled. "No one would ever imply anything." Exactly my point. There were good stretches, long ones. Stretches where the penthouse felt like a home rather than a transaction. Sunday mornings when he made coffee and she sketched at the kitchen island and they talked about everything and nothing. Quiet evenings when she fell asleep against his shoulder on the couch and woke up to find he'd covered her with a blanket rather than waking her. She knew his silences by then, the heavy ones that meant trouble he couldn't share, the comfortable ones that meant he was simply content to be in the same room with her. She'd learned to tell the difference. She also knew, in the way you know things you'd rather not, that his world would always have a gravity she couldn't fully see. There were conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. There were meetings she was never told about. There were people in his life who regarded her with a polite wariness, as if her presence was something they'd agreed to tolerate without ever fully accepting. She lived with that, because the man who came home to her every night was not the same man those people saw during the day. And she had to believe, that the version she got was the true one. That belief was what she was still holding on to the morning she first felt nauseous and thought briefly that she'd eaten something bad before the thought arrived that stopped every other thought in its tracks. The Tess sat on the edge of the bathroom sink for 3 minutes while Serena stood with her back against the wall and her arms crossed and her breathing very controlled. 2 lines. She stared at it for a long time. Then she picked it up, wrapped it carefully in a piece of tissue, and put it in her coat pocket. She walked herself to the corner pharmacy, bought a second test, went home, waited. 2 lines again. She sat on the bathroom floor for a while after that. Not crying, not panicking, just sitting with it, the way she always sat with things that mattered, completely still, letting the reality of it settle. She was 31 years old. She had a career she'd built herself. She had a marriage that was complicated and real and imperfect in ways she'd made peace with. And now she was carrying a child she hadn't planned for, whose father ran one of the most feared criminal organizations in New York City. The fear was there. Of course it was. But underneath the fear was something else, something she hadn't expected, something that felt, if she was being completely honest with herself, dangerously close to joy. She didn't tell Lucien that day, or the next. She scheduled an appointment with an OB she'd found by researching reviews for 45 minutes, went alone, sat in a paper gown under fluorescent lights, and watched the ultrasound screen with the concentrated attention she gave everything that mattered. The heartbeat was, she hadn't anticipated how it would sound. A rapid, insistent flutter. Already real. Already somebody. The doctor printed her a photo. Serena folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her purse, right next to her wallet, where she would see it every time she reached for anything. She spent the next 3 days planning how to tell him. She bought the baby shoes at a small children's boutique in the West Village on a Tuesday afternoon. They were white with a tiny yellow duck stitched on the side. Ridiculous. Perfect. She carried them home in a paper bag and sat at her design desk and stared at them for a long time, thinking about his face when he saw them, thinking about what he would say, thinking about the version of their future that was now, suddenly, possible. She imagined him holding their daughter. She didn't know it was a daughter yet, but she felt it, the way you sometimes feel things before you can prove them. And she thought that maybe this was the thing that would let them both finally stop managing everything from a distance and actually arrive inside their own life. She was carrying those shoes in her purse and the ultrasound photo against her heart when she came home early on a Thursday afternoon and heard laughter coming from Lucien's private office. The door was half open. That detail mattered later when she went back over it in her mind so many times she lost count. If it had been closed, she would have knocked. She would have announced herself. The whole trajectory of everything would have changed, but it was half open, and she was already walking toward it, already smiling because the sound of his voice, even just the low register of it, still did something to her after 3 years together that she'd never fully gotten used to. She stopped in the doorway. Lucien was standing near his desk. Vanessa Cross, his secretary of 5 years, a woman with the kind of polished, deliberate elegance that Serena had always found vaguely exhausting, was standing very close to him, her hands at his collar, straightening his tie. They were talking in low voices about a gala, something about the seating chart, something about which family members needed to be kept on opposite sides of the room. Nothing incriminating, nothing that should have frozen the blood in Serena's veins, but it was the closeness, the ease, the way Vanessa's hands moved without hesitation, without asking, the way Lucien stood completely still and let her do it, the private, practiced quality of the moment. It was the intimacy of people who did this regularly, people for whom this was normal, people for whom this was the routine. And then, before Serena could make herself move, she heard a voice she recognized, Lucien's oldest cousin, Marco, who had never once looked at Serena without that faint edge of condescension, say something from across the room. "What about your wife? She's going to be a problem for the gala optics." A pause. Lucien's voice, easy and dismissive. "Serena and I are complicated. Don't worry about it." Complicated. That was the word. Not she's the most important person in my life. Not she's my wife, and she'll be there. Not even a simple defense. Just complicated, the word you use for situations you're too tired to explain and too indifferent to fight for. Serena's hand moved, without her deciding to move it, to her purse. She could feel the outline of the baby shoes through the fabric. She turned around. She walked down the hall. She took this elevator down to the lobby. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold November air and looked up at the building she lived in and thought, with a clarity that felt almost brutal in its precision. He said I was complicated, in front of everyone, and he didn't even lower his voice. She didn't go back upstairs. She went to her studio instead, sat at her desk in the dark, and thought for a long time. She thought about her mother, who had stayed when she should have left. She thought about the baby shoes in her purse. She thought about the heartbeat on the ultrasound screen, that rapid, insistent flutter. And she thought about what kind of life she was willing to bring a child into. By morning, she had made a decision. It wasn't impulsive. People would assume later that she'd panicked, that she'd overreacted, that she should have stayed and asked questions. But the decision was not the result of panic. It was the result of 3 years of paying very careful attention to a man. And finally, in one overheard sentence, hearing the truth about how he thought of her when she wasn't in the room. She began making calls before the sun came up, and in her mind, very quietly, she said goodbye to the city she'd built her life in, goodbye to the woman she'd been inside those walls, and hello to whoever she was going to have to become in order to protect the life growing inside her. The tiny, insistent, already real life that Lucien DeLuca didn't even know existed yet. She was going home to Atlanta, and she was not coming back. She made 4 phone calls before 6 in the morning. The first was to her landlord, not the one on record for the penthouse, which was Lucien's name on everything, but the woman who managed the small studio space she'd kept in her own name in Brooklyn even after the marriage, the one Lucien had gently suggested she give up twice and she'd gently refused twice. 3 months left on the lease. She forfeited the deposit without argument. The second call was to her mother. Ruth Hale picked up on the second ring, which told Serena she'd been awake already. Her mother had never in 64 years of living slept past 5:30, a habit baked in by decades of early shifts that her body simply refused to unlearn even after she'd finally cut back to part-time. "Baby?" Ruth's voice had that particular quality it got when she knew something was wrong before anyone told her. Mothers developed a frequency for that. Serena had heard it maybe 3 times in her life, and each time it had meant something irreversible was already in motion. "I'm coming home," Serena said. "Not visiting, coming home." Ruth was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. "How soon?" "I need 3 days to handle things here, maybe 4. I'll make up your room." That was all. No questions. No what happened, or are you sure, or have you thought this through? Just, "I'll make up your room." Serena had to press her lips together very hard after she hung up. The third call was to her studio manager, a 26-year-old named Danny, who was frankly better at running the administrative side of the business than Serena had ever been. She told Danny she was relocating, that the business could go fully remote, that she'd explain everything in detail once she was settled, and that she needed Danny to handle client communications for the next 2 weeks without mentioning any of this to anyone. Danny said, "Okay, boss," in the flat, competent tone that had made Serena hire her in the first place. And that was that. The fourth call was to her own phone carrier, where she spent 11 minutes on hold before speaking to a representative and requesting a new number, effective immediately, with the old one disconnected by end of business. She packed 2 suitcases and 1 portfolio case. She left the jewelry he'd given her on the bedroom dresser, not dramatically, not arranged to make a point, just set down because none of it was hers in the way that mattered. She kept her own watch, a cheap one with a cracked face she'd bought herself the year she landed her first major client, the one she'd never replace because she liked the reminder of where she'd started. She did not leave a note. She thought about it, sat at the kitchen island with a pen in her hand for a while, but everything she could think of to write either sounded like an accusation or an explanation, and she was done explaining herself to someone who had reduced her to a complication in a sentence he hadn't even bothered to keep his voice down for. She took a car service to Brooklyn, spent 1 night at a hotel near the studio, and by Thursday evening she was on a flight to Atlanta with her suitcases in the overhead compartment and her hand resting flat on her stomach and the ultrasound photo still in her inside pocket. She didn't look out the window as the plane climbed out over the city. Lucien noticed she wasn't home by 10 that night, which wasn't unusual. He noticed her phone went straight to a disconnected message by midnight, which was. He sent a text that didn't deliver. He called twice more. He sat in the kitchen for a while with the lights off, telling himself there was an explanation, telling himself she was at Danny's or at a client dinner she'd forgotten to mention. By 2 in the morning, he walked into their bedroom and saw the jewelry on the dresser, and his chest did something it had never done before, just dropped, like a floor giving out. He didn't sleep. He called Marco at 7 the next morning, not to ask for help, but because Marco had been at the meeting and Marco had a long memory for details. "Did Serena come home last night?" he asked before Marco could say anything, a pause on the other end that lasted just a beat too long. "I don't know what Serena does." "Marco, what do you want me to tell you, Lucian?" "I want you to tell me if you saw her yesterday at the penthouse." Another pause. "I might have seen someone in the hallway." The line went very quiet. "What time?" Lucian said. It wasn't a question. "Around 4, maybe 4:30, before the family meeting broke up." Lucian hung up without another word. He stood in the kitchen for a long time after that. He thought about the meeting. He thought about what had been said. I thought about Vanessa and her hands on his tie, and how that would have looked to someone standing in a hallway, seeing only a partial frame of a scene. And then he thought about what Marco had said, "She's going to be a problem for the gala optics," and what he himself had answered without thinking, without weighing it, without once considering that the words might land somewhere they shouldn't. Complicated. He sat down at the kitchen table. He put both hands flat on the surface and he breathed. Then he called his head of security. "I need you to find my wife," he said, quietly. 3 days became a week. The week was the worst of it, in a way, because he still believed she'd surface. He knew Serena. She was not impulsive. She was not dramatic. She did not do things for effect. She had left because she had a reason. He told himself she needed space. He told himself when she was ready to talk, she would contact him. He left 2 voicemails on her old number before the automated message confirmed it was no longer in service. And after that, he stopped leaving voicemails because there was nowhere for them to go. His security team reported back within 48 hours. Serena had vacated her Brooklyn studio. Her forwarding information with the Postal Service was a P.O. box that led nowhere traceable. Her professional email was being managed by an assistant who responded to every inquiry with a polite note about transition and provided no other information. She had been thorough, more thorough than someone who'd made a panicked decision in the middle of the night. This had been thought through. That realization sat in Lucian's chest like a stone. He went through the motions of the next 2 weeks with the specific kind of controlled blankness he'd developed over 20 years in a world where showing weakness was an invitation. He took his meetings. He handled what needed handling. He said the right things to the right people, and none of it touched anything real because the real part of him was somewhere else entirely, running the same loop over and over. The hallway, the meeting, the word complicated dropping out of his mouth like it cost him nothing. Vanessa noticed first because Vanessa noticed everything. It was why she was good at her job and also, at times, why she was exhausting. She came into his office one morning with his schedule and set it on the desk and then didn't leave. "She's not coming back on her own," Vanessa said. Not unkindly, just directly, the way she always was. He looked at her. "You don't know that. I know women, and I know what she saw when she looked through that door." She paused. "I should have closed it." "That's not—" He stopped. "It wasn't what it looked like." "I know that. You know that." She picked up her iPad. "She doesn't." He didn't say anything for a moment, then, "Find out if she had any family she was close to, someone she'd go to." Vanessa looked at him steadily. "I already know. Her mother lives in Atlanta, Ruth Hale. I'll send you the address." She walked to the door, then turned back. "Lucian, for what it's worth, the way she looked at you was different from the way anyone else in your life looks at you. I noticed that too." She left before he could decide whether that made things better or worse. It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Petrov, a 71-year-old woman from Odessa who had worked in the DeLuca penthouse for 11 years and had approximately zero tolerance for things being left unsaid, who delivered the piece of information that changed everything. She was straightening the bedroom on a Tuesday morning, 10 days after Serena's disappearance, and Lucien was sitting on the edge of the bed watching her work in the listless way of a man whose internal compass had stopped functioning when she said, without looking up from the pillowcase she was smoothing, "She came back, the night of the family meeting, before she left for good." He went very still. "What?" Mrs. Petrov looked at him over the top of her glasses with the particular expression of someone who has been waiting a significant amount of time to say something. I saw her on the security feed. She came up in the elevator at 4:17. She stood outside the office door. She paused. For quite a while. The silence in the room was the specific kind that has weight. You saw the security footage. I check the cameras every night before I lock up. I always have. She set the pillow down and looked at him directly. She was holding her purse like this. Mrs. Petrov demonstrated. Arms slightly crossed, hand pressed against the side of the bag, protective. The way women hold something they are careful about. He thought about that for 1 second. 2. Did she have anything? Was she carrying anything when she came in? Just her coat and her bag. Mrs. Petrov picked up the second pillowcase. But she came back, Lucien. Whatever she went away angry about, she came back. A pause. And then she left again. He pulled up the security system on his phone right there, found the footage from that evening, and there she was. The timestamp read 4:17 p.m. She came off the elevator with her coat on, her purse against her side, and she walked down the hall toward his office with a particular purposefulness in her step, like someone who had been working up to something and had finally decided to do it. She stopped outside the half-open door. He watched her stand there. He could not see her face clearly from the camera angle. He watched her shoulders. He watched the way they changed, the slight drop, the almost imperceptible contraction, the movement of someone absorbing a blow they hadn't seen coming. She stood there for 2 minutes and 40 seconds. He counted. Then she turned around and walked back down the hall and got in the elevator, and the doors closed, and that was the last frame. He put his phone down on the bed. Mrs. Petrov had stopped pretending to smooth pillowcases. She was watching him with the frankness of someone who'd lived long enough to be done with delicacy. What was she carrying? He said again, quietly. In the purse. Was there anything? Did she ever show you anything before that day? Mrs. Petrov's expression shifted. Something moved across it. Not surprise, but the look of someone recalibrating what they're willing to say. 3 days before she left, she said carefully, I saw her at the kitchen table. Very early. She had a photograph. A photograph of what? I didn't see clearly. It was small. She was looking at it the way… Mrs. Petrov searched for the word. The way people look at something they're still deciding how to feel about. He already knew. He knew before she finished the sentence, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, the knowledge arriving like a physical thing, a pressure behind the sternum. He requested Serena's medical records through a legal channel he shouldn't have had access to, but did. What came back 2 days later confirmed what he already, on some level, understood. 7 weeks along as of her last appointment. She had left New York carrying his child. The argument with Marco happened 3 days after that, in Lucien's office, and it was the one that cracked the careful professional surface Lucien had been maintaining for 2 weeks. Marco came in without knocking, which he'd been doing his entire life, and which Lucien had stopped mentioning somewhere around 2015, and he sat down across the desk and crossed his ankle over his knee with the ease of a man who considered this space partially his own. The Ferrara sit-down is Thursday, Marco said. You need to be there. No distractions. I'll be there? I mean focused, present. Marco tilted his head slightly. She's been gone 3 weeks, Lucien. It's time to start handling this like a business decision instead of a… Don't. I'm just saying, Marco. Lucien's voice was very flat. I know what you're saying. Stop. Marco looked at him for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression. Not quite guilt, but its distant cousin. What she heard, it wasn't what it looked like with Vanessa. I know that. But what I said about the gala optics, sit there and don't talk about it. I'm trying to… You called my wife a problem. The words came out evenly. That was the scariest thing about Lucien when he was truly angry. He didn't raise his voice. He got quieter. In front of 8 people. In my house. And I sat there and called our marriage complicated instead of telling you to shut your mouth, which is what I should have done. He paused. That's on me. Not you. But I need you to be very clear that this subject is closed. Marco looked at him. Something passed across his face. Not exactly remorse, but the calculation of a man deciding whether a battle was worth fighting. He uncrossed his ankle, leaned forward. Your father wants to talk to you, he said, about the situation. What situation? Serena, Marco stopped, looked at his hands briefly. We know about the pregnancy, Lucian. The air in the room changed. How? Lucian said. Your father has people everywhere, you know that. How long has he known? Marco didn't answer, which was its own answer. Lucian stood up from his desk slowly. Get out. Lucian, get out of this office right now and don't come back in until I call you. His voice was still quiet. It was the quietest it had been all week. And tell my father I'll call him when I'm ready, which won't be today. Marco left. He had the self-preservation instincts of someone who had been around Lucian DeLuca long enough to know exactly where the line was. The call with his father happened that evening anyway, because Eduardo DeLuca did not wait for anyone to be ready. He called at 8:15 while Lucian was standing at the kitchen window looking at the city, and Lucian answered because not answering would have started a different and worse sequence of events. You should have told me, Eduardo said. He was 73 years old with a voice like gravel shifting in a metal drum, and he had not softened in any direction in the entire time Lucian had been alive. It wasn't yours to know. Everything in this family is mine to know. Serena isn't part of this family's business. A pause. She is carrying a DeLuca child. That makes her my wife, Lucian said, and nothing else. A wife who has disappeared. A wife who has taken a DeLuca heir and vanished without... She's not a vessel, Papa. His voice cracked slightly on that, just barely. She's a person who believed I didn't care about her and she left. Because of things said in this house. In front of people who should have kept their mouths shut. Another pause. When Eduardo spoke again, his voice had a different quality. Not softer, but more deliberate. She needs to come back. I know. And the child needs to be here, in New York, under... I'll handle it. How exactly do you intend to handle a woman who... Papa. He stopped, took a breath. I'll handle it. Leave her alone. I'm asking you, as your son, leave her alone until I can get to her. The silence on Eduardo's end lasted long enough that Lucian felt the first genuine spike of dread. I'll give you 30 days, Eduardo said finally. That's not a negotiation. She's not a territory. 30 days, Lucian. The line clicked. He stood at the window for a long time after that. The city spread out below him, lit and indifferent, the same city he'd grown up in, built his life in, built his power in. And for the first time in 20 years of managing threats in reading rooms and making calls that had irreversible consequences, he didn't know what the right move was. He knew what his father's 30 days meant. He knew what Eduardo DeLuca did when he decided something needed to be handled, and the person responsible wasn't handling it. He had seen it. He had, at certain points in his life, been the instrument of it. And Serena was in Atlanta, alone, pregnant, and completely unaware that the clock had started. He booked a flight for the following morning. Then he sat at the kitchen table, quote, the same table where she used to sketch while he made coffee, the same table where she'd looked at him across a Sunday morning once and said, I think this might actually work, with the specific wonder of someone who hadn't fully expected it to. And he stayed there until it was almost light, turning over every version of what he was going to say to her and finding that none of them were enough. Because there wasn't a version of this that started with, I can explain. There was no explaining the word complicated. There was no explaining away the footage of her shoulders dropping in that hallway. There was no undoing the fact that she had come back with something she was carrying carefully in her purse, something she'd been building up the courage to say. And he had taken that moment from her without ever knowing it existed. He had one shot, and his father's clock was already running. The flight to Atlanta boarded at 6:50 in the morning. Lucian sat in the back of the car on the way to the airport with his phone in his hand and his eyes on the window, and the particular stillness of a man who had made a decision and was now simply waiting for the moment when he'd have to live with it. He had not slept. There was no point pretending otherwise. His eyes felt like they'd been rubbed with sand and his jaw ached from holding it set all night, and none of that mattered because none of it was the problem he was flying south to try to fix. He had one carry-on bag. He hadn't told anyone in the organization where he was going except Vanessa, who had looked at him when he called her at 6 a.m. and said only, I'll hold your schedule through Friday, and asked nothing else, which was one of approximately 4 things about Vanessa Cross that he was genuinely grateful for. He did not tell his father. He did not tell Marco. He bought a coffee at the gate that he didn't drink, and sat with it going cold in his hand while the boarding announcements ran and the early morning travelers moved around him with their rolling bags and their headphones and their complete indifference to the fact that his entire life had reorganized itself around a single point of failure that he hadn't even seen happening until it was already done. The flight was 2 hours and 11 minutes. He spent most of it with his eyes closed and his head back against the seat, not sleeping, just holding himself very still, the way he'd learned to do in situations that required patience he didn't naturally have. He thought about what he was going to say. He'd been thinking about it for 3 days, and he still didn't have it right, because there was no version that started correctly. Every opening he'd drafted in his head sounded like a man managing a situation rather than a man who understood what he'd done. And Serena, who had always been able to tell the difference between those two things with an accuracy that still sometimes startled him, would know immediately. She would know. That was the part he kept coming back to. She had always known. She had known him in ways that nobody else in his life did, not because she had access to information about him that others didn't have, but because she paid attention in a way that was almost uncomfortable in its steadiness. She noticed things, small things, the way his posture changed when he was lying, even about small things. The specific quality of silence he went into when he was angry at himself versus when he was angry at someone else. The fact that he always touched the back of his neck when he was about to say something he didn't fully believe. She would know if he came at this wrong, and he couldn't afford to come at this wrong. Atlanta in November was overcast and carrying the particular chill that cities in the Mid-South did at that time of year. Not the brutal cold of New York, but a damp, gray, seeping kind that got into your coat differently. He took a rental car from the airport rather than a car service, because a car service left a record, and he needed this to be quiet. And he drove south through the kind of residential neighborhoods that he had no frame of reference for. Small houses set back from the road, mature trees still holding the last of their leaves, the occasional porch with somebody's outdoor furniture still out despite the weather. Ruth Hale's house was a pale yellow single story on a street that dead-ended at a small park. He had the address from Vanessa. He'd looked at it on satellite view 3 times during the flight, the way he prepared for any situation where he was walking into terrain he didn't know. He parked on the street and sat there for a moment. The rental car ticked quietly as the engine cooled. He got out. He was halfway up the front walk when the door opened, which meant someone had been watching for him, which meant Serena knew he was here, which meant she'd had some warning, which meant something had gone sideways before he'd even knocked. It was Ruth who opened the door. He'd seen pictures. She was shorter than he'd imagined, with Serena's same precise dark eyes and a quality of absolute stillness in her face that Serena had clearly inherited directly. She was wearing a house robe and slippers, and her arms were crossed over her chest, and she looked at him the way a woman looks at something she'd been braced for. "Mrs. Hale," he said. "I'm sorry to come unannounced. I need to speak with Serena." Ruth looked at him for a long moment, not with anger exactly, with assessment, the slow, thorough kind. "She doesn't want to see you," Ruth said. "I understand that." "Do you?" "Yes, ma'am. I still need to ask her." Another pause. Ruth's eyes moved over him once, quickly, the way a person does when they're confirming something they already suspected. Then she stepped back from the door, not welcoming him in exactly, but creating the space for him to enter. He stepped inside. The house smelled like coffee and something baking, and it was warm in the specific way of a house that someone actually lived in, full of the small accumulations of a life. Photos on the shelf by the door, a row of shoes, a cardigan draped over the back of a chair. He stood in the entry and waited. Ruth had already disappeared down the hall. He heard a door. Voices, low. He couldn't make out the words. He stood in the entry for 4 minutes. He counted. Then Serena came down the hall. She was 26 weeks along. He'd known that from the medical records, but knowing it and seeing it were different things entirely. She was wearing a gray sweater and dark pants, and her hair was pulled back, and she looked like herself, and also like a version of himself. He didn't recognize somebody who had put distance between who they'd been and who they were now, and done it with enough time and intention that the distance had become solid. She stopped about 8 feet away from him. She didn't look shocked. She didn't look angry. That was what hit him first. She'd been expecting this, or something like it, and she'd already moved past the initial reaction into something colder and more settled. "How did you find me?" she said. "Does it matter?" It matters to me. Vanessa knew your mother's name. I had someone run the address. He paused. I didn't bring anyone with me. I'm alone. She looked at him with the same steady, uncomfortable attention she'd always had, like she was reading something written in a language she knew well. What do you want, Lucian? He'd rehearsed this. All of it. He had the opening, he had the acknowledgement, he had the thing he needed her to understand about Vanessa and the meeting and what he'd actually meant versus what she'd heard. He had all of it lined up, and when he opened his mouth, none of it came out. What came out instead was, I didn't know you were pregnant. Her face didn't change. I know you didn't. You were coming to tell me. Yes. You had, Mrs. Petrov said you had a photograph at the kitchen table. Something moved across her expression. Small, gone quickly. The ultrasound, yes. And you came back that afternoon to tell you, yes. She said it flatly, not with bitterness, just with the particular tiredness of someone who had already processed this alone and was now being asked to process it again in front of the person who'd caused it. I'd been carrying those shoes around for 3 days working up to it. He didn't say anything for a moment. There was something happening in his chest that he didn't have good language for, a pressure that was partly grief and partly something more specific and sharper, the particular feeling of understanding the full shape of a mistake only after it's permanent. Serena, don't. Her voice wasn't loud. I don't need the explanation about Vanessa. I've had 3 months to think about it, and I understand what I saw and what I didn't see. That's not even the part that broke me. She looked at him directly. It was the word, complicated. In front of all those people. You didn't even... She stopped, pressed her lips together. You didn't even lower your voice, Lucian. He had nothing to say to that because she was right, and they both knew she was right, and saying I know felt insufficient, and saying I'm sorry felt like the beginning of a speech she'd heard the shape of before. I'm not asking you to come back, he said. That seemed to surprise her slightly. Her chin lifted a fraction. I'm asking you to let me be involved, he said, in whatever way you'll allow. With the baby. I'm not asking for anything about us right now. I'm just asking you to not make this decision alone. She was quiet for a moment. Outside somewhere, a car passed on the street. Ruth was in the kitchen, staying out of it with the very deliberate quality of a woman who was choosing to stay out of it. You don't get to show up here and renegotiate the terms, Serena said quietly. I didn't disappear to make a point. I disappeared because I couldn't raise a child inside a world where its father treats its mother like a footnote. That is what happened. Still quiet, still level. I heard it. I know what I heard. I know you do. He took a breath. And I know I can't undo it. I'm not here to argue about what it meant. I'm here because you're carrying my daughter and you're alone and He stopped. His voice had done something slightly uncontrolled on the word daughter, and he worked to bring it back. I need you to know that I'm aware of what I cost you, both of you. Something shifted in her face. It was there for just a second, a crack, a flash of the person who had loved him before she'd had a reason not to. And then she closed it back down, and he watched her do it, and it was the most honest thing that had happened in the entire conversation. You should go, she said. I'll think about a communication arrangement, about the baby, but I need you to go. He nodded. He turned toward the door. He almost made it. His phone rang when he was 3 steps from the front door. He didn't recognize the number, but the area code was New York, and something at the base of his spine went cold before he even answered. It was a woman's voice, administrative, formal in the specific way of someone reading from a script they'd been given and were not deviating from. Mr. DeLuca, my name is Catherine Voss. I'm a legal representative acting on behalf of Eduardo DeLuca and certain interests associated with the DeLuca family estate. I'm calling to inform you that a petition has been filed this morning in New York State Family Court regarding the minor child currently. He stopped walking. Serena was watching him from the hallway. What petition? He said. His voice was very quiet. A petition for primary custodial rights and legal guardianship of the child, to be vested in the DeLuca family estate upon the child's birth, on grounds of... Who authorized this? A pause. Eduardo DeLuca, as patriarch of... When was this filed? This morning at 9 a.m. Eastern. He lowered the phone from his ear. He stood in the entryway of Ruth Hale's house in Atlanta, 2 hours from New York, and he understood exactly what had happened. His father had not waited 30 days. His father had never intended to wait 30 days. The 30 days had been a misdirection, a way to keep Lucien flying south towards Serena, while Eduardo's lawyers were already moving north in a New York courtroom to do exactly what Lucien had asked him not to do. He had been handled by his own father. He turned around. Serena's face had changed. She'd heard enough. His voice, his stillness, the specific quality of shock that he couldn't keep out of his posture, to understand that something had gone wrong. "What is it?" she said. He looked at her for a second. Then he said, "My father filed a custody petition this morning, in New York, for the baby." The color left her face. "Before she's born," he said. "He's trying to establish custodial rights before she's even born." Ruth appeared from the kitchen doorway. She'd heard it. She was standing very still with a dish towel in her hands and her eyes moving between Lucien and Serena with the rapid, calculating attention of a woman who had survived enough hard things to recognize the shape of a new one arriving. "He can't do that," Serena said. But her voice had lost its steadiness. The flat, controlled tone she'd been holding the entire conversation had cracked down the middle, and underneath it was something raw. "He can't. She's not even. I'm not even." "He has lawyers who will argue he can," Lucien said. "And in New York State, with the resources he has, he'll find a judge who will at least hear it. I live in Georgia. He'll argue jurisdiction based on the DeLuca family domicile, and she hasn't been born yet, Lucien." Her voice had gone up slightly. She pressed her hand to the side of her stomach. "She hasn't been born. How does he have standing to—" "He doesn't. Legally, he probably doesn't. But he doesn't need to win. He needs to tie it up long enough to—" Lucien stopped. He turned and put his back against the wall and looked at the ceiling for a moment. He was putting it together in real time, the whole shape of it, the thing his father had actually been doing while Lucien was sitting at his kitchen table all night working out what to say to a woman who didn't want to hear him. Eduardo hadn't been trying to get Lucien to fix things with Serena. Eduardo had been keeping Lucien occupied while he sent his lawyers in the opposite direction to ensure that no matter what Lucien and Serena worked out between them, the DeLuca family would have a legal foothold in the child's life that didn't depend on what either of them chose. He hadn't been given 30 days. He'd been given a distraction. "Lucien!" Serena's voice had gone very controlled again. The rawness was still there, but she'd put something over it, the specific competence she applied to things that frightened her. "What does this actually mean, right now, today? What do I need to do?" He pushed off the wall. He looked at her. "You need a lawyer. Today. Not tomorrow. Today. Someone in Georgia who practices family law, and you need them to file a response in Georgia establishing the state as your domicile and the appropriate jurisdiction before New York can move further." I haven't had time to find family lawyers, and "I'll find you one," he said. "Give me an hour." She looked at him. He could see her calculating, the same thing she'd always done, the rapid internal assessment of risk and trust, weighing him against everything that had happened, trying to determine if this was help she could accept from a man she'd left, or another move in a game she didn't fully understand. "This is your father," she said carefully. "This is your family doing this." "Yes." "And you're telling me to trust you to protect me from them." He held her gaze. "I'm telling you I'm the only person in this room who knows how they operate, which means right now, whether you trust me or not, I'm the most useful person available." He paused. "After this, you can tell me to leave and I'll leave. But right now you need to move fast, and I know how to do that." The silence held for a long moment. Ruth spoke from the kitchen doorway. "Serena." Her voice was soft, certain. "You can be angry at him later. Let him make the call." Serena's jaw worked. She looked at her mother. Then she looked back at Lucien, and what was in her eyes wasn't trust. It was something harder and more practical than trust. The specific look of someone making a calculation rather than a choice. "1 hour," she said. "Make the call." The lawyer's name was Patricia Osei, and she was the kind of woman who answered her phone on a Thursday morning and said, "Tell me everything," before Lucien had finished explaining who he was. She had 22 years in Georgia family law and a voice like somebody who had heard every possible version of people behaving badly toward each other and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it. He talked. She listened. He gave her the filing information, the New York case number that the representative had given him, the names of Eduardo's legal team. "How pregnant is your wife?" she asked. 26 weeks. "Georgia domicile for how long?" 3 months. "And she's been living independently? Not financially dependent on the New York estate?" "Completely independent. Her own income, her mother's home, no financial connection to the DeLuca estate." He heard typing on the other end. "Jurisdiction argument's going to fall flat in New York if we move fast enough," Patricia said. "Georgia courts are going to be very reluctant to recognize a pre-birth custodial claim filed by a non-parent. Your father has no standing in Georgia. The question is whether New York tries to force the issue." She paused. "I need to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "Where do you stand? Are you adverse to your father in this, or is this a—" "I'm adverse," he said. "Completely." Another pause. He could hear her thinking. "You understand that if you position yourself against your father's petition and support your wife's Georgia jurisdiction claim, that puts you in direct legal conflict with your family." "Yes." "And you're prepared for that?" "Yes." "All right." The typing resumed. "Get your wife on the phone with me in the next 30 minutes. I'll need her to authorize me, and I'll have an emergency motion drafted by end of business today." He lowered the phone. Serena was standing across the room, watching him with her arms around herself and her hand pressed to the side of her stomach, the same gesture Mrs. Petrov had described. Careful. Like protecting something she was afraid of losing. "She needs 30 minutes, he said. "Can you talk to her?" Serena looked at the phone in his hand for a long moment. Then she crossed the room and took it from him. Their fingers didn't touch. She put the phone to her ear and walked toward the window. He listened to her voice as she spoke with Patricia. The steadiness of it, the precision, the way she answered questions with the specific directness of someone who had been organizing their own life for a long time and knew how. He listened, and he felt something settle in his chest that was not relief, because the situation was nowhere near resolved enough for relief, but was something adjacent, the specific feeling of having finally stopped standing still. His phone buzzed. A text from a New York number he recognized as one of his father's personal assistants. "Call your father." He turned it face down on the kitchen table. Ruth appeared beside him and set a mug of coffee down without asking. He hadn't asked. She'd made it anyway. She stood next to him for a moment, looking toward the window where her daughter was talking in a low, controlled voice to a family law attorney she'd needed to find in the last 40 minutes of her life. "She's stronger than she looks," Ruth said quietly. "I know," he said. "Stronger than she was 3 months ago even, which was already—" Ruth stopped. She picked up her own mug. "You should know that. Whatever you're planning to do next." "I'm planning to stay," he said. "Whatever she'll allow." Ruth looked at him sideways. "That's a big word, whatever she'll allow. Because she's going to make it hard. She's going to make it very hard. And not on purpose. Just because she's been putting herself back together and she's not going to want to undo that." "I know." "And your father, how far does this go?" He looked at the window. At Serena's back, her shoulders, the slight rounding of her frame that she was carrying with the same quiet steadiness she'd applied to everything in her life since she was 11 years old, making dinner because her mother was too tired to stand. "As far as it needs to," he said. Ruth was quiet for a moment, then, "That's either the most reassuring thing you've said or the most terrifying, and I haven't decided which." Across the room, Serena lowered the phone. She turned around. Her face was exhausted and set, and there was something in her eyes that Lucian recognized as the particular expression of a person who has just understood the full size of the problem they're in. "She's filing today," Serena said. "She says we need documentation of my residency, utility bills, my mother's lease, anything that establishes I've been living here continuously." She looked at her mother. "Do you have—" "Upstairs," Ruth said. "Everything's in the blue folder in the closet." Serena nodded. She looked at Lucian. "You need to call your father back." "I'm not calling him today." "Lucian." She took a breath. "If you go silent on him, he escalates. You know that better than I do." He looked at her. She was right. She'd never spent a day inside his world, and she was still right, because Serena had always understood power dynamics with a precision that he suspected came from growing up with very little of it. "What I say to him matters," he said. "I need to say the right thing." Then figure out the right thing fast, because Patricia says every hour we lose today is an hour they use to strengthen the New York filing. He picked up his phone. He stared at his father's assistant's message for a moment. Then he did something he had not done in 23 years of being Eduardo De Luca's son and operating inside the structure that made that mean something. He typed back, "Tell him I'm not available. And tell him that if any representative of the De Luca legal team attempts to make contact with my wife directly, or with her mother, or with any of her representatives, I will consider it a personal declaration of conflict, not a legal one." He sent it. His hands were completely steady when he put the phone down, which surprised him slightly, because what he'd just done was not a small thing. It was not a shot across the bow or a negotiating position. It was a line, drawn in the plainest language he knew, from a man who had spent his adult life inside a world that ran on implied threats and carefully managed ambiguity. He had just stopped being ambiguous. Serena was watching him from across the room. She'd seen him send the message. She hadn't seen the content, but she'd seen his face while he typed it. And she knew, she always knew, what a real decision looked like on him versus a managed one. "What did you just do?" she said quietly. He looked at her. Outside, the November sky had gone a darker gray, and somewhere down the street a dog was barking at something with the persistent, fruitless intensity of a creature that hadn't yet accepted that some don't respond to noise. "I chose a side," he said. The room was very quiet, and Serena Hale, who had stopped trusting him 3 months ago in a hallway in New York while holding baby shoes in her purse, stood in her mother's living room in Atlanta and looked at the man she'd married and said nothing at all. Because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't require her to admit that the wall she'd built since November had just developed its first crack. And she wasn't ready, not yet. The crack didn't close. Serena stood in her mother's living room for a long moment after she'd stopped speaking, and Lucian watched her wrestle with something she hadn't expected to have to wrestle with today. The possibility that the man she'd written off was still, underneath everything, the man she'd married. She didn't say anything else. She turned and walked down the hallway toward her room, and her hand was pressed against the side of her stomach the entire way, that same careful, protective gesture, and Lucian stood where he was and let her go. Ruth cleared his coffee cup without comment. He sat at the kitchen table and began making calls. The first was to his personal attorney in New York, a man named Greaves, who had handled De Luca business for 15 years and had, in that time, developed the specific talent of not being surprised by anything while also being visibly displeased by most things. Lucian explained the custody filing. Greaves was quiet for a long moment. "Your father filed this himself," Greaves said, "not through the family council. He used Catherine Voss, separate firm, which means he anticipated you might ask me to block it." A pause. "He's been planning this longer than 30 days, Lucian. I know that now. If I move against this, I'm moving against Eduardo. You understand what that means for my position with the family." "I understand. I'm asking anyway." Another pause. Longer. "What are you trying to accomplish? Legally. Give me the specific outcome." "I want the New York filing dismissed on jurisdictional grounds. Patricia Osei in Atlanta is already working the Georgia side. I need someone to put pressure on the New York end simultaneously. Make the filing look like exactly what it is, which is a non-parent third party attempting to establish custodial rights over an unborn child whose mother is domiciled in another state." "The argument's strong," Greaves said slowly. "But your father will find a judge who will at least give it a hearing, which buys him time, which is probably the actual goal. Then make sure the hearing doesn't happen fast enough to matter. Tie it up. Motion to dismiss, motion for change of venue, whatever you need. I need 60 days minimum." "To do what?" "To make the New York filing irrelevant." Greaves understood what that meant. If Serena delivered in Georgia with an established Georgia domicile and Georgia jurisdiction locked down before the New York court got traction, Eduardo's filing became a ghost, legally present but practically toothless, the kind of thing that cost money to maintain and accomplished nothing. "This is going to cost you," Greaves said. "Not the money." He didn't mean the money. "With Eduardo, I know what it's going to cost me." A beat. "All right. Send me everything Osei has by end of day." Lucian hung up and sat for a moment with his hands on the table and his breathing even and careful. He thought about his father, not with anger exactly, because anger was something he'd learned long ago to keep on a very short leash. He thought about Eduardo De Luca the way you think about a chess opponent after they've made a move you should have seen coming, with a cold, clear-eyed appreciation for the precision of it and the absolute determination not to let it happen again. His father had used him. Had used his love for Serena, the thing Eduardo had always privately considered a vulnerability, a softness in an otherwise functional son, as a mechanism to get Lucien out of New York while the legal machinery moved. It was, objectively, the kind of move Eduardo had always been best at, using what people cared about against them. The difference was that this time, the thing Eduardo had used against him was also the thing Lucien was now willing to burn everything else down to protect. He heard Serena's door open down the hall. She came back to the kitchen with a blue folder, the residency documents Ruth had mentioned. She set it on the table in front of him without sitting down. "My mother's lease goes back 8 years, she said. I'm listed as an authorized resident from 3 months ago. Utility bills in my name starting in September. My Georgia driver's license was updated 6 weeks ago." She paused. "I also have my OB records here. Every appointment has been at a clinic 12 minutes from this house." He looked up at her. "This is good. This is exactly what Ose needs." "I know." She pulled out a chair and sat down. Not across from him, beside him, at the corner of the table, so they were both facing the same direction, which felt like the most honest arrangement possible given where they were. "I've been thinking. Okay. Your father didn't do this because he cares about the baby." She said it flatly. Not as an accusation against Eduardo, just as a statement of fact she'd arrived at. "He did it because she's leverage. Yes. Over you. Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "So as long as you and I are, as long as we're not aligned, she's useful to him. As a bargaining chip. As a way to keep you manageable." He looked at her. She was doing the thing she did. The rapid structural analysis of a situation. The same cognitive process she applied to a design problem, working out which elements were load-bearing and which were decoration. "That's right," he said. "Which means the most direct way to neutralize his leverage is for us to be a unified front." She pressed her lips together. "Which he probably also anticipated." "Probably." "And has a counter for." "Almost certainly." She looked at the blue folder on the table. "So what do we actually do?" He thought about it for a moment. Not performing thought, actually thinking, because she deserved the real version. "We move fast on the legal side, which we're already doing. We make the New York filing irrelevant before it gains traction. And in the meantime," he paused, "I need to go back to New York and deal with my father directly." Her head turned toward him. "You just got here." "I know. You came all this way and now you're leaving. I came here to make sure you were willing to let me help. You are. The help I can give you now happens in New York." He met her eyes. "I'll be back before the baby comes. I promise you that." Something moved across her face. The word promise was complicated between them right now, and they both knew that. She let it sit without challenging it. "What are you going to do with your father?" she said. He picked up his phone and turned it over in his hand once, a habitual gesture. "I'm going to give him a choice," he said. "Drop the filing and step back, or I remove myself from the organization entirely." Serena stared at him. "You can't." "I can." "Lucien, that's not—" She stopped. She started again. "The organization is your entire life. You've been inside it since you were 19. You can't just—" "I'm aware of what I'm saying." "He'll say no." Her voice was tight. "Your father doesn't respond to ultimatums. You know that. He'll say no, and then where are you?" "Then I'm out." He said it quietly. No drama in it. Just the specific flatness of a man who had already made the decision and was now simply stating it. "I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks, since the night I saw the footage of you in that hallway. What I'm willing to trade for what?" He looked at the table. "The organization keeps running without me. It has before. My father's dealt with departures. He doesn't like them, but he survives them." He paused. "What he won't survive is a public break, which is what happens if I have to make this a fight. You'd make it public." "If I have to." She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her taking it apart, checking the structure of it, looking for the place where it collapsed. "You're not bluffing," she said. "No." "That's terrifying." "I know." She put both hands flat on the table, a gesture he recognized as her way of grounding herself when something was moving too fast. "Okay," she said. "Okay, go." But Lucien, she looked at him directly. If this goes wrong on your end, I need to know. I need you to tell me what's happening. I can't be sitting here not knowing. I'll call you, he said. Every day. Every day, she repeated. Not agreeing to, confirming, locking it down. Every day, he said again. He flew back to New York that evening. Marco was waiting for him at his apartment. Not the penthouse, which still felt like a place Serena had been present in and then evacuated from, but the separate apartment he kept in Midtown for exactly the kinds of situations where he needed to be somewhere his family didn't have the full run of. Marco was sitting at the kitchen counter with a glass of water and the expression of a man who had been sent somewhere he didn't particularly want to be. He wants to see you tomorrow morning, Marco said before Lucien had closed the door. 9 o'clock, the house in Westchester. I know what he wants. He's not in a negotiating mood, Lucien. I'm not going to negotiate. He set his bag down. I'm going to give him a single option, and he's either going to take it or he isn't. Marco looked at him for a moment. In the particular language that existed between men who had known each other since childhood and had spent their adult lives operating inside the same dangerous ecosystem, the look said, I know what this means, and I need you to know that I know. You're really doing this, Marco said. Yes. He'll cut you off. Everything. The accounts, I have my own accounts, Marco. I've had them for 15 years. He looked at his cousin steadily. I'm not 19. Marco put his water glass down. He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand, a gesture so old and familiar that it briefly felt like they were 12 years old again, arguing about something that mattered to no one. You know I can't back you on this. I know. It's not that I think he's right. The baby thing, the lawyers, that was... Marco stopped. He looked at the table. That was a bad call. I told him that. You told him, for what it was worth. And, Marco's expression answered that. I'm not asking you to back me, Lucien said. I'm telling you so you're not surprised tomorrow. So you can prepare for whatever comes after, however you need to. Marco was quiet for a moment. Then, is she okay? Serena. He paused. She's managing. Better than she should have to be. Marco nodded. He picked up his glass again and looked into it. She was always the best thing about you, he said. I never said that. But it was true. Lucien didn't respond to that. There wasn't a response that didn't sound either grateful or dismissive, and he was too tired for either. Go home, Marco, he said. Get some sleep. The house in Westchester was where Eduardo De Luca had lived for 31 years. A large, aggressively traditional estate behind a stone wall. The kind of house that announced its occupants' wealth without any particular interest in being liked for it. Lucien had grown up partly in this house. He knew the sound of every floor in it, the particular way the front door settled on its hinges, the fact that Eduardo always took his first meeting of the day in the study overlooking the back garden rather than the formal office. Because the formal office was for people Eduardo was performing authority for, and the study was where he said what he actually meant. He arrived at 8:55. He was shown in immediately, which meant Eduardo had been watching for him. The study smelled the way it always had. Old paper and the specific wood polish the housekeeper had used on the furniture since 1997. Eduardo was already seated behind the desk, with reading glasses on, and papers in front of him that Lucien recognized as the New York custody filing documents. He didn't look up immediately when Lucien entered. It was a power gesture so ingrained it had become unconscious. Lucien sat down without being invited to. That made Eduardo look up. You went to Atlanta, Eduardo said. Yes. Without telling me. I don't need to tell you where I go. Eduardo took his glasses off and set them on the desk with the deliberate care of a man organizing his patience. He was 73 years old, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had aged into something harder and more definitive. All the softness pressed out of it over decades of decisions that couldn't be taken back. He looked at his son the way he'd always looked at him, with the complicated, assessing attention of a man who was perpetually calculating the distance between what his son was and what he needed him to be. The filing was necessary, Eduardo said. It was a betrayal, Lucien said. I asked you for 30 days. You gave me a distraction. I gave you the opportunity to fix your marriage. You used it to fly south and hold your wife's hand while I handled the practical reality of the situation. The practical reality. Lucian let that sit for a moment. You filed for custody of an unborn child, Papa, without the knowledge or consent of either parent. That's not practical. That's a declaration of control over a person who isn't yours to control. She is carrying a DeLuca. Her name is Clara. His voice came out harder than he intended. We haven't announced it. Her name is Clara, and she is my daughter, and she is not a DeLuca asset. Eduardo's expression didn't change. That was always the thing with Eduardo. The face held regardless. Lucien had spent his entire childhood trying to read through that surface and never quite succeeding. You have responsibilities, Eduardo said, to this family, to this organization. You have built something here over 20 years, and you cannot simply— Drop the filing, Lucien said. Eduardo stopped. Drop it today, Lucien said. Call Voss. Have her file the withdrawal by end of business, and then call off whoever you have watching Serena in Atlanta. Because yes, I know there's someone watching, and that ends today as well. The study was very quiet. Somewhere outside a bird was making noise in the garden. The clock on the mantel ticked. Eduardo DeLuca looked at his son for a long moment. And if I don't, he said. Quiet. Measuring. Then I leave the organization. He held his father's gaze, completely, publicly, with a statement that makes the reasons clear. Something shifted behind Eduardo's eyes. Not fear. Eduardo didn't do fear, not exactly, but the rapid internal calculation of a man who had just been presented with a move he hadn't fully anticipated. You would destroy what you built. I would leave what we built. There's a difference. The organization survives without me. You know that. You've always made sure of that. You never let any one person become indispensable, including me. He paused. What doesn't survive is the public account of why I left. The New York custody filing becomes a matter of public record if it proceeds. The story of a grandfather attempting to legally seize an unborn child from her mother before she's even born. He stopped. That story finds legs, Papa, in ways that are bad for business. Eduardo was very still. You've thought about this, he said, for 3 weeks. You're prepared to walk away from everything. From this, yes. He looked around the study, the familiar walls, the familiar smell, the specific weight of a room that had shaped him in ways he was still sorting through. Not from my daughter, not from Serena. The silence stretched. Then Eduardo said with a flatness that was its own kind of answer, You realize she may not take you back regardless. I know that. You may end up with nothing. No organization, no wife, no, I'll have my daughter. His voice was steady. And I'll have done the right thing, which is something I haven't been able to say without reservation for a long time. Eduardo looked at him. He set both hands flat on the desk, a gesture Lucien recognized as his father's version of the same grounding motion Serena had made at the kitchen table, the move of a person who needed a surface to push against while they thought. I'll need time to— No. Lucien stood up. You don't get time. You have until 5 o'clock today. He reached into his jacket and put a card on the desk. Patricia Osei's card, her direct number written on the back. Osei will accept the withdrawal. That's all it takes. One call. He looked at his father. I'm asking you, as your son, to make it. He walked out of the study. He walked down the hall that he had walked down 1,000 times since he was a child, past the photographs on the wall. The formal family portraits, the business occasions, the images of men standing in configurations that said power and permanence to anyone who knew how to read them. He walked past all of it and out through the front door and into the November air, and he stood on the front step for a moment with his eyes closed. His phone buzzed at 11:43 a.m. He didn't recognize the number. Atlanta area code. He answered. Mr. DeLuca. A woman's voice, clinical, measured, the tone of someone who delivered information to people and had learned to do it without inflection. This is Dr. Yamamoto at Piedmont Atlanta Hospital. I'm calling regarding Serena DeLuca. She was brought in by ambulance approximately 40 minutes ago. She's asked us to contact you. A pause. She's 32 weeks along and we're seeing some concerning indicators of early labor. We're doing everything we can to slow the progression, but I need you to— He was already moving toward his car. I'm coming, he said. How long does she have? We don't know yet. That's why I'm calling now. I'm coming, he said again. He got in the car. His hands were on the wheel. and the key was in the ignition, and he was already calculating. Airport, next available flight, 2 hours in the air, car from Atlanta Hartsfield, 40 minutes to Piedmont. And the total time was too long. It was all too long, and there was nothing he could do about any of it except drive. He drove. His phone was on the seat beside him, and it buzzed once. A text from an unknown number that he did not look at because he was doing 80 in a 55 zone. And the only thing in the world that existed right now was the road in front of him, and the hospital 2 hours away, and the woman in it who had left because he'd called her complicated, who was now lying in a hospital bed 32 weeks along trying to keep their daughter inside her body long enough for her to be safe. He hit the on-ramp and he drove, and he did not think about his father, or the filing, or the organization, or any of the 20 years of architecture he had just told Eduardo De Luca he was prepared to demolish. He thought about Serena. He thought about the way she had looked standing in her mother's living room this morning, exhausted and set and carrying herself with the specific dignity of a woman who had decided she would not collapse regardless of what else happened. He thought about the crack that had opened in her expression when he'd said, "I chose a side." He thought about the baby shoes in a purse he'd never seen, bought 3 days before she disappeared, carried with a care that Mrs. Petrov had noticed from across a kitchen. He thought about a heartbeat he had never heard. He got to the airport in 31 minutes. He left the rental car at the curb with the keys in it and his bag in the trunk, and he ran. The departures board showed a flight to Atlanta boarding in 14 minutes at gate C7. He ran. He hit the security line, and the agent looked at his ID and his boarding pass. Vanessa had somehow already sent one to his phone. He didn't know when. She must have been tracking his location. And the agent waved him through, and he ran the length of the terminal with his jacket open and his breath coming hard. And the gate agent was reaching for the door when he got there, and he said, "Don't close it." And she looked at him, and whatever was in his face made her step back and let him through. He got on the plane. He sat in the first available seat and put his seatbelt on, and the door closed behind him, and the plane began to move, and he sat with his hands on his thighs and his eyes forward and his breathing deliberate, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the specific technique he'd learned in a different context for a different kind of controlled situation. And he thought, "Hold on, Serena, just hold on." His phone had to go to airplane mode. He turned it off and put it in his pocket and felt the specific helplessness of being at 30,000 feet when something on the ground was happening that he had no ability to affect. The particular terrible stillness of a powerful man confronting the boundary of what power actually reaches. He sat in that stillness for 2 hours and 11 minutes. The plane landed. I was the first person off it, pushing past the apologetic shuffle of other passengers, with a directness that left no room for social negotiation, and he was through the terminal and in a cab before the gate door had finished opening, and he said Piedmont Atlanta Hospital, and the driver started moving, and Lucian turned his phone back on. 14 missed calls. 3 from Ruth. 4 from a number that was probably the hospital. 1 from Greaves. 1 from Marco. 1 from Vanessa. And 4 from a number he didn't recognize until he saw the text attached to the last one. "This is Patricia Osi. Your father's attorneys filed a withdrawal of the New York petition at 4:47 p.m. today. Georgia jurisdiction is uncontested. Call me when you can." He stared at that text for a long moment. Then he closed it and dialed Ruth. She picked up on the first ring, and her voice had that quality again. The one he'd heard that morning, the frequency mothers developed for things already in motion. But underneath the steadiness, there was something tight and frightened that Ruth Hale was working very hard to keep contained. "Where are you?" she said. 10 minutes out. Ruth, how is she?" A pause that lasted 1 second too long. "They stopped the labor," Ruth said. "For now. But Lucienne," her voice caught on something, just briefly. "You need to get here. She's asking for you, and I need you to get here right now." The cab hit a red light. Lucian looked at the light. The light did not change fast enough. "Run it," he said to the driver, and his voice was so quiet and so completely certain that the driver looked in the rearview mirror once and then ran. The cab ran the light. Nobody said anything after that. The driver kept his eyes forward, and Lucien kept his phone pressed to his ear, and Ruth stayed on the line without speaking because there was nothing left to say that would make the next 8 minutes pass faster, and they both understood that. Piedmont Atlanta Hospital appeared through the windshield as a cluster of lit windows against the evening dark. Lucien had the door open before the cab fully stopped, which was reckless, and he didn't care. He was through the main entrance before the automatic doors had finished sliding apart, and he found the information desk and said, Serena DeLuca, and the woman behind the desk checked her screen and said, labor and delivery, 4th floor, and he was already at the elevator. The elevator took 40 seconds. He counted. Ruth was in the hallway when the doors opened, standing with her arms crossed and her house clothes still on from this morning, which meant she'd left in a hurry, which meant there had been no time to change, which told him everything he needed to know about how fast this had happened. She looked at him, and her face did something complicated. Relief and exhaustion and the specific expression of a woman who had been holding everything together in a room by herself and was now being handed the first available person to share the weight with. She's stable, Ruth said immediately, because she was a woman who understood that the most important information went first. They gave her medication to slow the contractions. It's working, but the doctor wants her monitored through the night and possibly longer. The baby. Heartbeat is strong. They did an ultrasound 20 minutes ago. Ruth's voice held steady on that. She's okay. For now. He let out a breath. Just one. Then he pulled it back in and held himself together because falling apart in a hospital hallway was not something that would help anyone. Can I go in? He said. Ruth looked at him for a moment. She asked for you, she said. So yes. But Lucienne. She put one hand briefly on his arm. The first physical contact she'd initiated with him since he'd arrived on her doorstep that morning. She's frightened. She won't say it, but she is. Don't make her manage you right now. I won't, he said. Ruth stepped aside. He pushed open the door. The room was the specific beige and fluorescent of every hospital room that had ever existed, which somehow made everything in it feel more exposed. Like the ordinary world had been stripped away and left only the essential things. The monitors, the IV line, the bed, and Serena in it. She was propped up slightly, with the fetal monitor straps across her stomach and an IV in the back of her left hand, and her hair loose around her shoulders because there'd been no time to put it up. She was wearing a hospital gown, and she looked smaller than she did in real life, which was something that happened to people in hospital beds regardless of how strong they actually were, and it hit him somewhere low and undefended in a way he hadn't braced for. Her eyes found him the moment the door opened. She didn't say anything right away. She just looked at him, the same steady, reading look she'd always had, running quickly over his face the way she did when she was checking the state of him. He let her look. He walked to the chair beside the bed and sat down in it and didn't reach for her hand because he didn't know yet if that was something she'd want. You made it, she said. Her voice was hoarser than usual, tired in a way that went beyond today. I made it, he said. She looked at the monitors for a moment. They're saying she's fine. The heartbeats... She stopped, swallowed. They say it's strong. Ruth told me. That's good. That's... Serena, that's good. I know. She pressed her lips together. I know it's good. I know she's okay right now. I just... Her voice cracked, just slightly, just at the edge. She pulled it back. I've been alone in this room for an hour, and I've been trying not to think about what would have happened if they hadn't gotten here in time, and I've been... She stopped again. She turned her face away from him toward the window, where there was nothing to look at except the dark and the reflection of the room. I'm really tired, Lucien. I know, he said quietly. Not just today. I mean... She turned back. Her eyes were wet but not spilling, held back by the same disciplined control that she applied to everything. I'm tired of doing this alone. I'm tired of being the person who handles everything. I've been handling everything since I was 11 years old, and I'm 31, and I'm in a hospital bed, and I'm... The tears came then, not dramatically, just quietly, the way things gave way in people who'd been holding on too long. I'm really tired. He reached over then. He put his hand over hers, carefully, without pressure, just present. And she looked down at his hand on hers, and she didn't pull away. I've got you, he said. Right now. I've got you. She cried for a few minutes, not loudly. The monitors kept their steady rhythm, and the IV dripped, and she cried with the specific quality of someone releasing something they'd been carrying at significant personal cost for a significant amount of time. And he sat beside her and kept his hand over hers, and didn't say anything else because there was nothing else to say that was more useful than just being there. When it passed, she took a long, shuddering breath and reached for the tissue box on the bedside table with her free hand. Your father withdrew the filing, she said. I know. Osei texted me. Did you know he was going to? No. He paused. I gave him the choice. I didn't know which way he'd go. She looked at him. What did you offer him? I told him to drop it, or I'd leave the organization publicly. The room was very quiet for a moment. And he chose to drop it, she said. Yes. Why? He thought about it honestly. I don't know if it was because I asked him as his son, or because a public exit was bad for business. Probably both. With my father, it's usually both. He paused. Does it matter? She considered that. I suppose not. She looked down at their hands. You were really going to leave? Yes. Everything? Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Outside in the hallway, someone was pushing a cart, and the wheels made a rhythmic sound on the linoleum and then faded. The fetal monitor kept its steady count, 148 beats per minute, strong and insistent, the same rapid flutter Serena had heard alone at the OB clinic 2 months ago and had folded into her heart without telling anyone. I bought those shoes in the West Village, she said, on a Tuesday. It was cold and I walked about 6 blocks further than I needed to because there was a children's boutique I'd noticed once, and I thought... She stopped. I thought you'd think they were ridiculous. The duck on the side. I almost bought a different pair that were more... She made a small, exhausted gesture. Serious. But then I thought, no, these are the ones, and I bought them. He was listening very carefully. I was going to give them to you that Thursday, she said. I had the whole thing planned out. The shoes in a box, the ultrasound photo underneath. I was going to make you open the box before I said anything. She took a breath. I wanted to see your face. I know, he said. I know you were. You don't know. You know the outline of it. But you don't know that I was... She turned toward him slightly, and her expression was the most unguarded he'd seen it in months, in maybe years. The careful architecture she maintained having come down in layers over the last several hours. I was so happy, Lucian. I was terrified and I was happy, and I was so sure that you were going to... that we were going to... She didn't finish that sentence. She didn't need to. He tightened his hand slightly over hers. Tell me what you need, he said. Not long term. Right now. Tonight. What do you need? She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very simply, Don't leave. Okay, he said. Tonight. Don't leave tonight. I won't leave tonight. And don't try to fix anything else tonight. Don't talk about Atlanta or New York or your father or any of it. Just... She leaned her head back against the pillow and closed her eyes. Just be in the room. I'm in the room, he said. I'm right here. She was asleep inside 20 minutes. The medication and the exhaustion and the sustained adrenaline of the day caught up with her all at once, the way it did, and she went under quickly and deeply, her breathing evening out into something slow and rhythmic. He stayed in the chair. He didn't move. He watched the fetal monitor and listened to the heartbeat. 148 beats per minute, steady, stubborn, already so specifically itself. And he sat in that beige room in Atlanta with the fluorescent light and the IV dripping, and outside the window, the city going about its ordinary Thursday night business. And he thought about what it meant to be in the right place at the cost of every other place you'd ever stood. He thought it was probably worth it. Ruth came in at midnight to check on Serena and found Lucian still in the chair. He'd moved it closer to the bed at some point. His jacket was folded over the arm and his sleeves were rolled up, and he looked like a man who had no intention of going anywhere, which Ruth registered with a quiet, particular attention. She checked the monitors. She smoothed Serena's blanket, a small automatic gesture that had nothing to do with the blanket needing smoothing, just a mother making contact with her child in the only way available. Then she looked at Lucian. You should eat something, she said quietly. I'm fine. There's a cafeteria. I'm not leaving. Ruth looked at him for a moment. Then she pulled the extra chair to the other side of the bed and sat down. They sat on opposite sides of Serena's bed in the dim room, and for a while neither of them said anything. She doesn't make things easy, Ruth said finally. Not a criticism, just a fact. I know. Even when she wants something, she makes you prove it's real before she'll let herself have it. Ruth looked at her daughter's sleeping face. She's been that way since she was small. After her father left, she closed a door. She still loved people. She still let people in. But there was always this other door, further back, and she watched it. She paused. She stopped watching it with you, for a while. He didn't say anything. She told me once that you were the first person she'd ever felt. Her word was legible with, like she didn't have to translate herself. Ruth's voice was even. That's not a small thing for Serena. I know what I had, he said quietly. Then you know what you need to earn back. Ruth folded her hands in her lap. Not through grand gestures. She doesn't trust grand gestures. She trusts Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday morning when nothing particular is happening. She paused. Can you do ordinary, Lucian? Because that's what she needs. Not protection from your father, not someone to fight her battles. She can fight her own battles. She's been doing it her whole life. She needs someone who shows up when there's nothing dramatic requiring it. He thought about that for a moment. He thought about the Sunday mornings with the coffee and the sketching, the evenings on the couch, the arguments about typefaces and color theory that had lasted longer than any argument about anything important, because they were the kind of argument you could only have with someone you were completely comfortable with. I can do ordinary, he said. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, stood up, smoothed her own clothes the way she'd smoothed Serena's blanket, and walked to the door. There's a pull-out in the waiting room 2 doors down, she said. If you want to sleep, I'll sit with her. I'm okay here, he said. She looked back at him once. Then she left. He stayed in the chair. Serena was discharged after 4 days, with instructions for modified bed rest and twice weekly monitoring and a list of warning signs that the discharge nurse went through with the careful specificity of someone who had delivered the same information many times and understood that people in crisis don't retain things reliably. Lucian sat beside Serena during the discharge summary and asked 2 clarifying questions and wrote down 3 things on his phone. Serena noticed him writing them down. She didn't say anything, but he saw her notice. He drove them back to Ruth's house in the rental car he'd left at the curb outside the hospital for 4 days. It was raining, not hard. The particular Atlanta drizzle that seemed to come from everywhere at once without any real directional source. Serena sat in the passenger seat with the seat pushed back to accommodate her stomach and the discharge papers in her lap and her eyes on the wet road. Patricia called this morning, she said. The Georgia jurisdiction is locked. Your father's attorneys haven't made any further filings. Good. Greaves sent me a summary. The New York petition has been formally withdrawn. I know, he copied me. She was quiet for a moment. It's really over, the legal part. Yes. And your father? He kept his eyes on the road. We haven't spoken since Westchester. His assistant has reached out twice. I haven't responded. She turned her head toward him slightly. You need to eventually. I know. Not for him, for you. She paused. Whatever he did, he's still your father, and Clara is going to have a grandfather whether we like it or not. How that goes is something we'll need to figure out. He looked at her briefly. We. She'd said we without appearing to notice she'd said it. He didn't point it out. Some things needed to settle at their own pace. I'll call him, he said, when I'm ready. She accepted that and turned back toward the window. Ruth had made soup. It was on the stove when they came in, the kind of simple, fundamental cooking that people did for each other during hard times. Nothing elaborate, just a gesture that said, I was here while you were gone, and I was thinking about you. She hugged Serena for a long time in the front hall without saying anything, and Serena held on with both arms and her eyes closed, and Lucian set the bag down and stepped into the kitchen to give them the moment. He stayed. Not in the hospital sense and not in the dramatic sense, but in the plain, unglamorous, logistically complicated sense of a man who had a life in New York that required managing from a distance while he slept in the spare room of a house in Atlanta and learned the specific geography of someone else's domestic rhythm. Ruth's house had 1 bathroom with a slow drain in the sink. The spare room had a ceiling fan with a wobble in it that ticked every 3rd rotation. The neighborhood was quiet in a way that New York had never once been in his memory. A deep, almost total quiet after 10 p.m. that he found firstly disorienting and eventually, unexpectedly, restoring. He worked remotely. Greaves handled the New York business with a competence that Lucian had always known was there and had simply never had occasion to fully rely on. He took calls in the backyard where the reception was slightly better, standing under the overhang while it drizzled. talking about wire transfers and legal structures and organizational decisions in the same measured voice he'd always used, and then hanging up and going back inside to ask Ruth if she needed anything from the grocery store. It was strange. He was aware of how strange it was. He had spent 20 years operating inside a world that was entirely his own construction. The decisions, the geography, the relationships, all of it built around the specific shape of what he needed it to be. And now he was in someone else's house, in someone else's city, operating around someone else's schedule. And it required of him a quality of self-effacement that he had never particularly practiced. He was bad at it initially. He reorganized the kitchen cabinet without asking, and Ruth noticed and said nothing, and he found it reorganized back to its original configuration the next morning and understood the communication without needing it translated. He made suggestions about the hospital appointments that were slightly too directive, and Serena looked at him once with a very specific look, and he stopped. He had a phone call about an organizational dispute in New York that went 40 minutes, and he came back to find dinner had happened without him and cleaned up. And he sat at the cleared kitchen table and understood that he was going to have to get better at knowing which things needed his full attention and which things needed him to put the phone down. He got better. Not quickly, not gracefully, but incrementally, in the way that people actually changed, not through a single revelatory decision, but through the accumulation of small corrections, each one building on the previous one, the process unglamorous and nonlinear and occasionally frustrating. Serena watched him getting better. She didn't say so. She was not the kind of person who narrated progress. But he noticed the way she'd started telling him things again. Small things, the texture of her days, what the doctor had said, what Ruth had found funny, what she was working on in her design work, and he understood that as a form of trust returning. Quiet, provisional, but real. They had one real argument, 3 weeks after the hospital, over something that was and wasn't about the thing it was actually about. It started over a practical decision about the birth plan, whether to add Lucien as an authorized contact at the hospital, which Serena had initially resisted, and it turned quickly into the thing underneath the thing, which was whether she was actually willing to let him back in, or whether she was managing a situation while keeping the real door closed. "I'm not trying to control the birth plan," he said. "I'm asking to be there." "You're on the authorization form. That's not the same thing, and you know it." She looked at him. Her jaw was tight. She was 34 weeks along and she was exhausted, and she did not have the energy for this conversation and was having it anyway. "I know," she said. "I know it's not the same thing." "Then what is this?" "This is me still being scared." She said it plainly, without apology. "This is me not being 100% sure that letting you all the way back in is safe. And I know that's not fair to you. I know you've been here. I know what you've given up. I know what the last 3 weeks have looked like. But I can't make myself feel safe before I actually feel safe, Lucien. I can't rush it." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands. "I'm not asking you to rush it. You're asking me to add you to the authorization form." "Yes." "That's—" She stopped. She pressed her hand to her side. "That's not small for me. That's not a form. That's a decision about what I'm letting you be." He looked at her. "I know that. I'm still asking." She looked back at him for a long time. The ceiling fan in the next room made its 3-beat tick. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed on the street. "Okay," she said. "I'll add you." It was not a romantic moment. It was not the scene from the movie where the music comes in and two people understand each other perfectly. It was two tired people in a small house in Atlanta making a decision that required more courage than either of them made it look, and then moving past it into the ordinary evening with its dinner and its television and its 10 o'clock quiet, which was, Lucien was beginning to understand, exactly what real things looked like. Clara arrived on a Thursday morning at 6:42, 7 weeks after the hospital scare, at 39 weeks exactly, which the doctor called remarkable given everything, and which Serena called stubborn, which Lucien thought was probably the most accurate assessment of who Clara was going to be. The labor was 11 hours. It was not easy. Serena went through it with the specific, teeth-set determination she applied to everything that mattered, which meant she did not pretend it didn't hurt, and she did not pretend she wasn't frightened, and she also did not stop moving forward for 1 second. Lucien stayed. He stayed for all 11 hours, which was longer than he'd known anything to be, and he was not useful in the ways he was used to being useful. He couldn't fix anything or call anyone or make a decision that moved the situation forward, and he had to find what it meant to be useful through presence alone, which was the hardest thing he'd done in a life that had included a number of genuinely hard things. He held her hand. He didn't tell her it was going to be fine because he didn't know that, and she would have known he didn't know it, and the lie would have been worse than the silence. He handed her ice chips and said nothing when she gripped his hand hard enough that his knuckles went white, and he stayed when she told him to stay and moved when she told him to move. And at 6:37 she said very quietly, "I'm so tired." And he said, "I know, you're almost there." And at 6:42 Clara was born. She weighed 6 pounds and 3 ounces. She had Serena's nose and her eyes closed and her whole face doing the specific scrunched, furrowed work of a person just arrived somewhere unexpected. The nurse put her on Serena's chest, and Serena made a sound he had never heard her make, something open and raw and not formed into any particular language, and put both hands around the small body and held on. He stood beside them. He didn't cry. He didn't think it was possible that he wouldn't, and then it simply wasn't. Something else happened instead, something that wasn't expressible as crying, a kind of radical rearrangement of the interior, like furniture moved to reveal a room he hadn't known was there. After a while, Serena looked up at him. "Do you want to hold her?" she said. He sat down on the edge of the bed. The nurse transferred Clara to his arms with the specific efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times, and still understood it was not ordinary. He looked down at his daughter. She weighed nothing and everything simultaneously. That was the only way he could have described it. The specific paradox of holding something that small that mattered that much. She had his coloring and Serena's proportions, and she was entirely herself, already, in a way that made all of his previous ideas about inheritance and legacy feel suddenly and completely beside the point. He looked at her for a long time. "Hi," he said quietly. Just that. 2 months later, Eduardo De Luca drove himself to Atlanta. No driver, no advance notice, beyond a single text to Lucian that said, "I'd like to meet my granddaughter." Lucian had looked at the text for a long time and then shown it to Serena, who had looked at it for her own long time, and then said, "It's her grandfather. That's her choice to make eventually, not ours." Which was, Lucian thought, the most precisely correct thing anyone had said about any of this. Eduardo arrived on a Sunday afternoon. He stood in Ruth's living room in a coat that was too formal for the house, and held his hat in both hands with the specific awkwardness of a man of considerable power who had arrived somewhere that his power was not the relevant currency. Ruth offered him coffee, and he said yes in a voice that was slightly quieter than his usual register. Lucian sat in the kitchen and let Serena handle it, which was something he would not have been capable of 3 months ago. He heard the low exchange of voices in the living room. He heard Ruth say something that made Eduardo respond with a brevity that sounded, from the kitchen, like chastened agreement. He heard Serena's voice, measured and clear, without hostility but without concession either, establishing the terms of this visit and every possible future visit in the specific way she established all terms, quietly and without room for renegotiation. Then he heard nothing for a while, which meant someone had picked up Clara. He waited. After a long moment, he walked to the living room doorway and stood there. Eduardo was sitting in Ruth's armchair, the floral one with the worn arm that was Ruth's reading chair, and which Eduardo, to his visible credit, had accepted without any particular adjustment to his posture. Clara was in his arms. She was awake, which she frequently was at this hour, her eyes doing the unfocused, earnest exploration of a 2-month-old encountering a new surface to look at. Eduardo looked down at her with an expression Lucian had never seen on his father's face. It was the expression of a man encountering something that his entire operating framework had not prepared him for. Not weakness. Nothing as simple as that. More like the sudden presence of a thing he had not known he was missing, arriving without warning in an armchair in a pale yellow house in Atlanta, wrapped in a yellow onesie, looking back at him with Serena's dark eyes and absolute trust in the fundamental safety of being held. Clara reached out and wrapped her fingers around Eduardo's thumb. He stared at her hand. Lucian stayed in the doorway. He didn't say anything. Serena was on the couch, watching her father-in-law with the careful, assessing attention she brought to all things. And when she sensed Lucian in the doorway, she turned to look at him, and what passed between them wasn't forgiveness exactly, and wasn't an ending. and wasn't even really a beginning. It was something more like an acknowledgement that they had been here, that they had come through the specific, expensive, non-refundable thing that had happened to them. That what existed now was not the thing from before, was something different, shaped by everything that had broken it and built back up unevenly and imperfectly and in ways that would take years to fully understand. She didn't smile. He didn't either, but she held his gaze for a long moment and then looked back at Eduardo and Clara, and he walked into the room and sat on the couch beside her. Eduardo stayed for 2 hours. He and Serena had one real conversation about what his expectations were and what the boundaries of his access would be, and what it meant to be a grandfather rather than a patriarch. And it was not comfortable, and it was not the kind of conversation that resolved everything, but it was honest in a way that conversations in the DeLuca world rarely were. And when Eduardo left, he shook Lucian's hand and then surprised both of them by turning to Ruth, who was standing near the door with her arms crossed and the expression of a woman who had decided to reserve judgment but had not finished reserving it, and saying, "Thank you for opening your home." Ruth looked at him. "She's my daughter," she said. "I'd have opened it for anyone who needed to come through it." Eduardo nodded. He put his hat back on. He walked out to his car and drove north without looking back, and Lucien stood at the window and watched him go and thought about what it meant to be a son and what it meant to be a father, and how much space existed between those two things when you were standing at exactly the point where one ended and the other began. Serena appeared beside him at the window. They stood there for a moment. "He's going to try again at some point," she said, "to manage something, to be involved in a way that's more about control than care." "I know. And when he does, I need you to deal with it." "I will." She looked at him. "Not almost. Not eventually. When it happens." "When it happens," he said. "I'll deal with it." She held his gaze for another moment. Then she nodded, once, the small firm nod she used when something had been decided. Down the hall, Clara had started making the low, preliminary sounds that preceded actual crying by approximately 90 seconds. A vocalization that Lucien had learned to recognize over 2 months of midnight shifts and early mornings with the precise attentiveness he'd once applied to reading rooms full of dangerous men. He was already turning toward the sound before Serena had moved. "I've got her," he said. He walked down the hall. He went into the small room that Ruth had cleared out for the crib. Painted yellow, because that had been Serena's favorite color since she was 5, and she'd denied it her entire adult life and finally admitted it when they were choosing the room. And he lifted his daughter out of the crib before she could fully escalate into crying and held her against his chest with the practiced ease of someone who had changed more diapers in 8 weeks than he had in the preceding 40 years of his life. Clara settled. She always did, when held. She had strong opinions about being held. He sat in the rocking chair, the one Ruth had bought secondhand and repainted white, and presented without ceremony the week Serena came home from the hospital, setting it in the corner of the yellow room with the same matter-of-fact affection she applied to all necessary things. And he rocked, and the chair made its small, rhythmic sound. And outside the window, the afternoon was going gold with the specific late light of December in the south, the kind that came in low and warm and made everything it touched look like it was already remembered rather than currently happening. Serena appeared in the doorway. She didn't come in. She leaned her shoulder against the frame and watched him with Clara for a moment, her arms crossed loosely, her expression quiet and unguarded in the way it got sometimes now, in the ordinary moments, when there was nothing requiring her to protect herself. "She's going to be impossible," Serena said. "She's going to be exactly like you," he said, which is the same thing. Something at the corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the shape one makes before it arrives. "Move over," she said. He shifted in the rocking chair, which was not designed for 2 adults, but was wide enough to manage it if neither of them was precious about comfort. And she sat on the arm of it and leaned against him and looked down at Clara, who looked back up at both of them with the dark, grave attention of someone taking a thorough inventory of what she had available. They stayed like that for a while. The chair rocked. The light moved. Down the hall, Ruth was in the kitchen, and the sounds of ordinary life, a cabinet opening, water running, the small domestic percussion of a household continuing to be itself, came through the walls of the yellow room where the 3 of them sat in the particular kind of quiet that is not the absence of noise, but the presence of something that doesn't need to be said out loud to be completely real. Clara closed her eyes. Outside, the December afternoon kept going gold and then deeper. And then the first dark came in at the edges of the window, and Lucien de Luca, who had once measured success in territory and fear and the specific silence that fell in rooms when he entered them, held his daughter in a second-hand rocking chair in Atlanta and did not measure anything at all.